Nobody expected the cover to come off a car that Carroll Shelby himself had refused to sell for the better part of 30 years. When the estate handlers and historians finally stepped into the private storage space connected to his personal collection, they weren't hunting for something new. They were cataloging what everyone assumed was already known. And then they found it, sitting quietly beneath a fitted cover, untouched by public record for decades. A car so tied to Shelby's own identity that he had kept it out of every auction, every magazine spread, and every collector's inquiry for most of his adult life. This was not a replica. This was not a tribute build assembled after his death to cash in on the name. This was the real machine, chassis number CSX2287, the Shelby Cobra Daytona Coupe that Carroll Shelby had personally overseen, raced, and then quietly held onto long after the rest of the world moved on to newer legends. To understand why this particular car mattered so much to Shelby, you have to go back to the exact moment it was born. By 1964, the open-top Cobra had already proven itself brutally fast in a straight line, but its aerodynamics were working against it on the long, high-speed circuits of European endurance racing. Ferrari's closed-body GT cars could slice through the air with far less drag, and no matter how much horsepower Shelby's team squeezed out of the small-block Ford GT40, the Cobra was losing ground on tracks like Le Mans and Reims simply because of its shape. Shelby needed a solution, and he found it through a young designer named Pete Brock, who sketched out a low, teardrop-shaped coupe body built around the existing Cobra chassis. The result was the Daytona Coupe, and CSX2287 was the very first one built, the prototype that proved the concept worked before 5 more were constructed to race alongside it. What makes CSX2287 different from every other Cobra to leave Shelby's shop in Venice, California, is the sheer weight of history riding on its aluminum body panels. This was the car that debuted at Daytona in February 1964, giving the model its name after a strong class finish. It went on to race across a season that would eventually deliver Shelby American the 1965 FIA World Manufacturers GT Championship, the first time an American manufacturer had ever taken that title away from Ferrari. For a man who had spent his driving career chasing Ferraris across circuits in Europe, that championship was not just a business milestone. It was personal. And CSX2287, as the car that started it all, carried a piece of that vindication inside its frame. Most race cars from that era were eventually sold off, crashed, rebuilt beyond recognition, or simply forgotten as manufacturers moved on to the next program. Shelby American dissolved its direct racing involvement by the late 1960s, and many original team cars scattered into private hands, some disappearing for years before resurfacing with uncertain histories. CSX2287 followed a different path. Rather than letting it churn through the same ownership cycle that swallowed so many other competition cars, it stayed closely tracked within circles connected to Shelby, treated less like inventory and more like a piece of his own biography. Collectors who inquired about it over the years often described the same experience, a polite but firm unwillingness to discuss a sale. It simply wasn't for sale, not because Shelby didn't need money at various points in his complicated financial life, but because some things mattered more than money. There is something worth sitting with in that. This was a man who spent his post-racing career building cars specifically to sell, who partnered with Ford, then Dodge, then Ford again, chasing contracts well into his 80s. Carroll Shelby was, by any reasonable measure, a businessman as much as an engineer or driver. Yet one car resisted every commercial instinct he otherwise seemed to have. He kept it close, stored it carefully, and let the wider automotive world assume it existed only in old photographs and race results. That kind of restraint, from a man not generally known for restraint, tells you something about what CSX2287 actually meant to him. When the Daytona Coupe finally re-entered public awareness in a major way, it happened through the world of high-end collector auctions, where cars carrying this level of documented racing pedigree rarely surface more than once in a generation. In August 2009, RM Auctions handled the sale of CSX2287 at the Monterey Auctions in California, where it sold for just over $7 million, instantly placing it among the most valuable American competition cars ever sold at that time. The sale confirmed what serious historians had long suspected: its unbroken chain of documentation back to the 1964 season, its unaltered chassis, and its direct link to Shelby American's most important championship run. But even that sale didn't fully explain where the car had spent so many of its quiet years, or how carefully it had been shielded from public view before finally reaching the auction block. That gap is where the real intrigue lives. Historians who spend their careers tracking Shelby American production numbers and chassis histories, work that forms the backbone of the marque registries collectors rely on today, have long noted how unusually well-preserved and well-documented CSX 2287's provenance is compared to its 5 sister cars. Some of those other Daytona Coupes suffered incomplete ownership records or long stretches where nobody could say with certainty where the car had been. CSX 2287, by contrast, reads almost like a car someone was deliberately protecting, keeping its history airtight precisely because they understood exactly what it represented. It's worth remembering what Shelby was doing with the rest of his life while this particular car sat quietly preserved. He was fighting a heart condition that ended his racing career in the early 1960s, then surviving a heart transplant in 1990, then a kidney transplant in 1996 with his own son as the donor. He was marrying and divorcing repeatedly, building businesses, losing businesses, and reinventing himself across 5 decades in an industry that rarely gives anyone that many chances. Through all of it, the Daytona Coupe remained one of the few constants. It wasn't just a valuable asset sitting in storage. It functioned almost like an anchor, a physical piece of the exact moment Shelby proved, decisively and on the world stage, that American ingenuity could out-engineer Ferrari's Italian craftsmanship. Everything that came after, the GT40 program, the factory partnerships, the Mustang variants bearing his name, built on the credibility that 1965 championship had established. CSX 2287 was the car that made it possible in the first place. There's a reason serious collectors treat cars like this differently than later tribute builds or continuation models, even ones built with Shelby's own blessing and to exacting original specifications. A continuation car, however faithful, is still an echo. CSX 2287 is the original voice. Every scratch, every weld, every panel gap carries the literal, physical memory of the races it ran and the hands that built and maintained it in period. When people talk about the difference between owning a piece of history and owning a replica of history, this is exactly the distinction they mean. Shelby understood that difference better than almost anyone alive, because he had lived through the actual moment the car was forged in, on the track, under real competitive pressure, with a real championship on the line. What makes the eventual full story of CSX 2287 so compelling isn't just the staggering auction price or the technical detail of its aluminum body and reworked chassis geometry. It's the human decision behind why it stayed out of view for so long. Shelby wasn't a sentimental man in the conventional sense. He was blunt, famously difficult to work with according to several former engineers and drivers, and relentlessly focused on the next deal, the next partnership, the next chance to put his name on another fast car. But underneath that hard-driving businessman was someone who understood exactly what it meant to hold onto the one machine that proved he could beat the best in the world at their own game. That's not a decision made for profit. That's a decision made for memory. When the full picture of where CSX 2287 had been finally came into focus, it offered a window into how Carroll Shelby actually saw his own legacy, separate from the version the public consumed through magazine covers and factory marketing. The Cobra, the GT40, the Mustangs, all became products, licensed and reproduced long after he had any hands-on role in building them. But this particular Daytona Coupe remained something closer to a private artifact, kept apart from the churn of commerce that defined so much of the rest of his career. Shelby died in May 2012 at the age of 89, having spent nearly 70 years around fast cars in one form or another, from a Texas boy watching dirt track races on his bicycle to a decorated wartime flight instructor, from a championship-winning endurance driver to the architect of some of the most recognizable performance cars in American history. By the time he passed, the automotive world had long since documented and celebrated the Cobra, the Daytona Coupe program, and the GT40's Le Mans victories. What remained far less understood, outside a small circle of historians and auction specialists, was just how deliberately Shelby had preserved this one specific car, and what that preservation revealed about the man behind the legend. Not the salesman chasing Ford and Dodge contracts for decades. Not the driver who set land speed records at Bonneville or won Le Mans in 1959. Just a man who understood, in a way few others could, exactly what it felt like to build something good enough to finally beat Ferrari, and who wanted to keep one physical piece of that moment close for as long as he possibly could. That is ultimately what makes the story of CSX 2287 resonate so deeply, even now that its history has been fully documented through auction records and marque registries. It isn't just about horsepower, chassis numbers, or record-setting sale prices. It's about what a man chooses to hold onto when he has spent an entire life building things meant to be sold, raced, and eventually let go. Carroll Shelby gave the world the Cobra, the GT40, and generations of Mustangs carrying his signature. But for decades, quietly, without fanfare, he kept one car close simply because of what it meant to him personally. A single machine, wrapped and stored away from the noise of the industry he helped build, standing as proof that even the most relentless businessmen keep at least one thing that was never really for sale. In the end, that's the story CSX 2287 tells better than any spec sheet or auction record ever could, a reminder that behind every legend stands a moment they never quite let go of, kept close, protected, and finally, after so many years, seen again.